So what I'm going to try and do is introduce to you a body of knowledge which as being the kind of the science of improvement or systems thinking and its relationship to the scientific method and so on. So I'm going to try and give you some kind of background to that. Probably it would really help me is as we're going through the session for you to think about what you think the implications are for population health management. I'm not explicitly going to relate things to it, not because it's not important to do so, but I think actually it would be much more insightful if you played back those reflections, either in terms of questions or comments or kind of highlights. So if you don't hear me say PHM, you are in the right webinar, but it's really, I'm going to try and take us back to first principles with some of these things, which I think is actually really quite important for us. Okay, so I'm just going to move on now. So the work that I'm going to draw on was really the body of work that William Edwards Deming put together. You can read the slide on the screen, but if there was a tweet about Deming, it would be something like one of the key figures accredited with the turnaround in Japanese manufacturing industry. And he helped to set out really the foundations of what we now call the science of improvement. And really, I'm going to try and give us a taster of some of those ideas. Deming's prescription for trying to get improvement to be kind of much more reliable, happen more successfully, and so on, was about identifying 4 bodies of knowledge, really. Something about, he called it a system of profound knowledge, but its components are really the key thing here. Something about appreciation of systems, something about the variation, something about knowledge, and something about the psychology of people. And the aim of the exercise is to try and help us deliver continual improvement, innovation, through a kind of spirit of cooperation, really. Now, these are all perhaps very abstract ideas, and we will get into some of the detail of it. But for now, I just want you to appreciate that each of these components that I'm pointing to at the moment, systems, variation, knowledge, and people, these are essentially different departments in universities. Or variation, you'd kind of maybe think of stats department, knowledge as philosophy, and psychology is obviously psychology, and systems could be engineering or business. But the point is that if a student wanted to go and acquire a mix of these different types of systems of knowledge, it would actually, it's not easy to get this kind of interdisciplinary knowledge base that I think is required. And this is one of Deming's key contributions, really putting together a number of ideas which constitute a systems approach to thinking about improvement. Okay, so the next slide. So this, if you've seen this before, just kind of, just take some time out. But if you haven't, this is an exercise for you to have a look at. So imagine that there is a situation where we have a leader, a manager, who is responsible for various workers, and the workers are listed in the first column as Mary, Joe, and Eva, and up to Carl. And they're doing a very important job under identical conditions. They've had identical training, and every time they make a serious error, we record that error. So, for example, if you look at the last row of the table, Carl, for example, has made 1 error on week 4, and Ed, for example, has made 2 errors in week 6. And our aim is really to try and improve the situation, improve the performance of what's going on here. So the question for you would be, what action do you think might be taken in order to deliver improvement in this particular circumstance? For now, if I can give you a sense of some of the typical responses that people give, and see how that kind of resonates with your own thoughts, really. Some people will identify Eva as being the worst performing worker for the obvious reason that she has 7 errors, and some people will identify that actually kind of recalibrating Eva in some way, retraining her or something would be a good thing. having a word with her, putting her under kind of special measures. Alternatively, we could also try and look to see what people like Mary and Joel and Jim and Kate are doing, because they've had no errors at all, and try and perhaps look out for kind of really good workers, our best performers, and maybe ask our best performers to support our weaker performers. And perhaps those are the kind of two extremes. Occasionally, some people have spotted a cyclical pattern for either, which, if you have a look at the data, you can kind of maybe spot. And some people thought that week 7 was particularly bad as the weeks go. Those are the kind of responses that most people make. And the person who developed this exercise has presented this to thousands, really. And if your response was along those lines, then be assured that you're in good company, because so many other people also responded in the same way. Unfortunately, all those responses would actually be incorrect, because the data that you see in front of you was generated by a random number generator on Myron Tribus's computer, and then he just rearranged it in a table and put some names on it. Now, if that doesn't quite mean anything to you at the moment, don't worry. It's not intuitive to understand randomness, but appreciate for now that, imagine this was a situation where they all had a dice and there was rolling their dice. Then we would be saying that Eva's had the worst run possible, and Mary's has had the best run. But the explanation for best and worst would be entirely due to the mechanism of chance. There is no skill involved in rolling the dice. It's just the mechanism of chance or randomness which is at play here. So in actual fact, there is no difference between those workers at all. All the errors that you see there are due to the system and the conditions that they're working in, and the action to reduce error rates would be not to dismiss anybody, would be not to retrain anybody, but would be actually to change the underlying system that produced that data. We'll get more chances to think about this as we go on. We'll have a few takes on this, because some of this is, if you've heard it for the first time, it can be a little bit counterintuitive. And if you do feel you want to ask questions and clarifications, just fire away, please, because Lorna's keeping an eye on the chat box and will nudge me accordingly. Okay, let's have another take at this. So if you look at slide 6, just have a look at the object, kind of the shapes that you see, and try and guess what you think this object actually is. If you look at slide 7, you'll see that in actual fact it is a bicycle. Now, one of the things about this slide, what you see is, if you think of the bicycle as a system on the right-hand side, if you go to the left-hand image, what we've done to the system is we've taken it apart. And when you take apart a system, it actually loses its essence, and it's really quite difficult to recognize it as a system once it's been taken apart. So on the right-hand side, we've got exactly the same shapes, but because they're put together as a set of components in a familiar way, we straight away recognize them as a bicycle. So key insights from systems theory are captured in this diagram, really. One is that a system is a network of interdependent components that work together to accomplish the aim of the system. So a system has to have an aim. A system has to have components which work together, so it's characterized by cooperation and not competition. And if you go to the left-hand side of the slide, when you take the system apart, actually it loses its essence. It's almost impossible, or at least it's quite difficult to recognize what it actually is. So that's one of the some of the key lessons from systems thinking. Another thing that you can, again, you may have seen this image before. There's a kind of elephant with blind men, different parts of the elephant. And every human sensor in this diagram is actually reporting back as honestly as they can, as kind of accurately as they can from their perspective. And from their perspective, their descriptions are correct. However, it's not until you get to see the whole do you actually get to see the system and recognize not just the whole, but recognize what the different perspectives are and why they are what they are. So one of the key things about systems is to try and find a way to visualize them or make them visible to as many people as possible, so that we're all seeing the system in the same way, or we're all seeing the elephant in the same way. And if you think back to the bike example, when you take the bike apart, it's hard to see the whole. When you look at the example of the errors by Eva and Mary and so on, I hid the system behind the scenes. So it's actually not so easy to see the system. What you just see is the workers. So in practice, what you find is that being able to see the system and share that perspective is actually not such a straightforward thing, but a very important thing nevertheless to try and achieve. And one of the ongoing questions will be is how you see PHM, population health management, actually helping us achieve some of that clarity about the system and its aim and its components. Okay, so slide 9. So just a few things then, just to think about in terms of systems. One of the things about systems is when we're thinking about a system as a whole, we want to try and make the whole bike better. When we try and make the whole bike better, it doesn't mean that every bit of the component of the bike will actually be better. What I'm trying to say there is that if you think about if you got the world's best bike parts in a room, the best wheels and the best handlebars and the best seats and all the bits and pieces that go in it, and you try to put it together, it actually wouldn't work because none of those components actually cooperate. But in order to make a good bike, you don't need every component to be world class. What you need is all the components to actually cooperate. The other thing to note is that when you're trying to make the bike better, actually some components may not improve as a result of it. Likewise, if you try and optimize the parts, then the whole will not be optimized. I'll give you better examples of this later on in a slide, but just these are just some lessons from systems theory. And another, just to replay, an organization can hire the best people, but if they don't work together, then disaster would loom. One of the other lessons of systems is if left to themselves, the components can become selfish, competitive, independent profit centers that destroy the system. That's really quite important to appreciate, really, that selfishness and competition is actually, and it undermines the ability of a system to work towards its aim. And systems benefit from cooperation. That's the secret, not competition. And a key part of leadership and management is to remove the barriers to cooperation, so that cooperation becomes a norm rather than competition. And a factor which enhances competition is performance management, which tends to lead to a situation where you get more competition and less cooperation. One of the reasons performance management does that is because attached to it is money or reputation or kudos or some other kind of extrinsic factor. And people try and optimize their share of that because that's what the performance the key performance indicator is. And in so doing, they're not able to cooperate with other parts of the system. So on slide 10, so with small systems fail at the boundaries. If you think about the bike and the broken bike, bikes break at the joints. They don't really break within a component, but they break at the points at which one component joins another component. And likewise, systems are weakest at the boundaries, and so they fail at the boundaries. The other kind of axiom of systems is that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the result it gets. That's really, really profound to kind of, once you get that, you will understand why it was wrong to try and sack Eva. And Deming pointed out that 94% of the trouble lies with the system. And that's the responsibility of those who design and manage it, not those who work inside it. 6% are special causes, special reasons, which we won't go into too much today, but just recognize that there is a small marginal component which is unusual even in any system, but it shouldn't overwhelm us in terms of our strategies for thinking about improvement, we should think of them as a kind of special case, but not as a usual case. And systems need to be managed. They don't manage themselves. It's a bit like a well-looked-after garden. There is a caretaker someone who manages it very, very closely. Just to give you some other ways of thinking about systems, and this notion of sub-optimization versus optimization, where you're thinking about components, i.e. parts versus the whole. If you just have a look at this diagram, imagine I'm responsible for 3 departments, A, B, and C, and I have some money, and I say to departments A, B, and C, can you put in some improvement plans, improvement projects, business cases, where you bid for some money and it's on the basis of some positive impact for your department. So Department A submits 3 plans, and each plan has a positive impact on Department A. Department B puts in 2 plans with positive impact for B, and C puts in 3 plans with positive impact for C. And you could argue that if I've got enough money, if I funded all of those 3 departments, that life would get better. But if you take a systems view, and I show you a bit more of the whole, so this is now showing you the relationship between the departments. So if I read the first row to you, so Department A, the first plan, has a positive effect on Department A. But actually, when you look across the line, you see it has a negative impact on B and a negative impact on C. And actually, the net effect, if you just add up the pluses and minuses, is a negative. So in fact, if you were to fund all 3 grey boxes, the net effect on the system would actually be a double negative, even though each one of the plans in their own right was a positive for the department that produced that plan. And that's the challenge with systems, to try and understand the distinction between sub-optimization and optimization. Sub-optimization makes a component better, and optimization makes the whole better. So if you want to make the whole better in this particular illustration on the next slide, what you'll see is the plans that should be funded are the ones which have a net positive effect on the whole. So there are only 3 plans, therefore, that are worth funding. And each one of those plans, if you trace them back, have a negative impact in some cases. So the first plan, a negative impact on B. The second plan had a negative impact on C. And likewise, the third plan, a negative impact on B. Yet, despite those negative impacts, the impact on the whole is actually a triple plus. So this is an illustration really of the difference between sub-optimization versus optimization. And one of the things I think that population health management is trying to help us do is trying to address this particular kind of, this particular illustration actually, and how it manifests in the world of healthcare and the wider health and care system. But anyways, I'll keep prodding you to think about what the implications are for population health management, or what kind of insight you think this helps you with. So I'll move on to slide 14. This is just another way to think about systems and the role of leadership. So on the left-hand side, I've got these arrows. These arrows are components in a system. And the system is defined in its aim by that dotted arrow at the back. So that's the aim of the system. And I'm suggesting on the left-hand side that that aim is not very well articulated or understood or visible. And what you have is different components in the system trying their best, but actually not necessarily aligning with the aim. The job of leadership is to move us from the left-hand side towards the right-hand side, where we get this alignment. The aim is very clear, and then the components align towards that aim, because leadership has created an environment in which the aim is clear and components cooperate towards the aim. And what you'll see in the right-hand side as well as the left, but we'll stick to the right for now, is we're not so interested in we're interested in the alignment of the arrows. We're not interested in the size of the arrows. So some arrows are bigger, some are smaller. It doesn't matter that the arrow is big or small. What matters more is that the arrows are aligned. And in the left-hand side, I would say to you that most components, they are trying their best. But without an aim and without cooperation towards that aim, actually we end up with essentially kind of chaos really, whereas on the right-hand side is a kind of ideal that I think we're aiming for. And population health management, I think, is trying to move us from the left to the right. And how well we succeed in doing that is to be determined. But I think that's one of the key things I think it's trying to help us achieve. Okay, and slide 15 is just another way to think about a system where you have a clear aim, you have all these different components working together to deliver that aim. And one way to visualize a complicated system which is coordinated towards an aim is an orchestra. Now, all analogies fall apart at their kind of extremes, really, but I've tried to use different images and different analogies, really, to try and portray to you some of the insights that we get from systems thinking and systems theory. And what you notice in an orchestra is that there isn't competition between components. There's a clear aim and there's clear cooperation towards that aim. And the better that cooperation is and so forth, the better the output that comes from the system. Some of you may actually be in an orchestra and be able to tell me a lot more about what it does or does not feel like to be in an orchestra. A few other things on anti-systemic thinking. So I'll just let you read those those kind of cartoons and enjoy them for what they are. And what's interesting about this cartoon is that it's in the private sector. So these are, you know, anti-systemic thinking is not just a curse of the public sector. It's to be found in a wide variety of settings. And another example of anti-systemic thinking is on the next slide. And then the final example is a little bit text heavy, but I'll just ask you to have a quick read of that. This is a debate happening in the body parts as to who is in charge. The next slide is really this notion of trying to help us see that even things where we think we're looking for behavior change, kind of what role the system plays, really. I won't say too much about this. I'll just play the video and I'll just let you enjoy this video. If you've seen it before, then fine, but it speaks for itself, really. It's only a minute and a bit. Okay, don't worry. Okay, should I carry on? So if you've seen that before, you know, that's kind of, it's fun, but the lesson from it really is, I think it's really quite remarkable. The notion that when we're trying to change behavior, role of the system in shaping that behavior and helping us think about how to try and develop the conditions under which there is a change of behavior. What is remarkable instance is also the pity that we're thinking about developing this kind of stage. There's a whole theory called fun, and you can also another example in your own time called fun theory for speed camera lotteries. So even speed camera lotteries could become fun. And what I love about systems thinking is that it does give you the option to liberate yourself into thinking about different ways a system could be redesigned so that we achieve the things we do. Okay, I'm just trying to move on to the next slide. Oops. Yeah. So that's a summary of systems. So systems need an aim, they need cooperation. Systems, you have to be very careful you don't sub-optimize components. You think about optimizing the whole. And one of the most amazing systems we know is the human body. And one of the things about the human body is this enormous level of cooperation that it enjoys. So for example, if my teeth are hurting, it's actually my feet that take me to the dentist. So that's the enormous level of cooperation that the human body enjoys. And that's why it's a very complex, successful system. Likewise, leaders need to think about how we try and get cooperation towards the aim of a system in kind of health and care terms. The second part of the session will be around variation. So we've had a quick look at a little bit of that in the early slides. And Deming said this about leadership and management is the failure to understand information and variation. So perhaps, and that first slide, where less than maybe 2 or 3 people in 1,000 actually saw that was a problem. It wasn't Mary and Eva. It was actually down to the system, and that illustrates really this particular point. So I'll show you some data. This is data from colorectal cancer survival. This is from 1991. It was published in the BMJ. It looked at variation outcome by surgeon over 5 years. And if you look at that data, I'm sorry, slightly misaligned, but for our purposes, it'll still suffice. You can see you've got surgeons A to M on the left-hand side. You've got the number of patients that survived, the number that died, and you've got a percentage mortality, and then you've got a case mix adjusted hazard ratio. And the question that the authors were wrestling with was, what should we do to try and improve outcomes following colorectal cancer surgery? And if you were to kind of browse that in your own time, you would be attracted to those surgeons who've perhaps got very low death rates, those that have got very high death rates. And you could look at that through the crude mortality percentage. So here's a surgeon with 29 and 30%, for example, and here's one with 8. Or you through the case mix adjusted hazard ratio, which is a little bit like a hospital standardized mortality ratio. It's just, if it's 1, the surgeon is neutral. If it's above 1, then the surgeon is tending towards increasing the risk of death. And if it's less than 1, the surgeon is a good thing, is helping reduce the risk of death. Anyways, I don't want to dwell too much on the data. I just want to give you a sense of this notion of variation and how people think about it. So the authors of the paper concluded the following. They said that, to them at least, the conclusions were clear. Some surgeons perform less than optimal surgery. Some are less competent than their colleagues. And then if there was more attention to detailed results of surgery could be improved. So essentially what they're saying is that if we could identify our bad surgeons and somehow deal with them in some way or other, things would get better. And I think that's, if you go back to the example of Mary and Eva and the errors per week, I think they're actually saying more or less the same thing as we discussed in the first slide. So what I'm going to do is try and give you a sense of why that's not, why those conclusions are not correct. It's quite a bold statement to make, really, but let's move on. Okay, so let's do a little exercise. This is a letter A. It's a gold standard A, and for the purposes of this kind of webinar, my aim, your aim, is to try and produce A's as close as possible to the gold standard. So if you feel like you want to do this, this would be great. Just try and write out 7 A's as close as possible to the gold standard on your kind of piece of paper and pencil. Just handwrite 7 A's as close as possible to the gold standard. And I'm just about to do the same. So here are my A's. And what we could do once you've got your A's, I'm going to make a safe assumption, I think, that nobody has produced 7 perfect A's, and use what's on my slide as an illustration of what typically might be produced by someone writing on a piece of paper. Now you could look at those A's and you could compare them to the standard, and for those A's which are close to standard, you could say that's great, well done, have a reward. You know, this is good performance. And for the A's that are below the gold standard, we could institute some sort of kind of reflection, retraining, some sort of name and shame or punishment system, just to try and help me kind of work out on the basis that some of my A's are good and some of my A's are not so good. Now, the reason that would be unhelpful, in fact, it would be not just unhelpful, it would be fundamentally wrong, is because of the following fact. Those A's that you see on the screen were produced by a common process, and all the conditions that could have affected those A's, all the conditions were constant, at least as constant as can possibly be. So they were all produced under the same date, same time, the same place, the same pen, the same pressure, the same light, the same humidity, the same temperature, the same blood pressure, the same caffeine levels, the same hand, the same friction, the same paper. Anything you can think of which could influence the A's was actually constant. So therefore, it's very important to then understand that the conditions that produce the first A are identical to the conditions that produce the last A. And from the point of view of the process, all those A's are actually the same. No A is better or worse than its peers. And any attempt to separate those A's into good and bad is actually belying the fact that they're all produced by the same system. And if I was performance managing the situation in the traditional way, I might actually reward people for good A's and punish them for bad A's. I might ask people to kind of reflect on why they've got such bad A's and ask them to kind of in some way redress that problem. So if I had 100 providers of A's and they sent me A's like this, I could punish some of the providers and I could praise some of the providers on the basis of what they're sending me. And that's what performance management would try and do, but it would belie the fact that the underlying process is actually identical in all those providers of A's. So this theory of variation that I'm about to discuss with you is called Walter Shewhart's theory of variation, and this is some of his insights. He argued when you see variation coming from a stable process, i.e. all the conditions are constant, then you have to recognize 2 things really, that the variation has a common cause, and that common cause is the process, and that the action required to address that variation is to actually change the process. Okay, so under common cause setting, no A is better or worse than its peers, they're all the same. And the action required to improve our A's is to actually change the process. And in changing the process, we should recognize that not every change will lead to an improvement. So for example, if I said that I'm going to change the pencil to a sharper pencil, it's not likely to make a major difference. If I said I'm going to change from a black pen to a blue pen, that's not likely to make a major difference. But if I said, I'm going to give people a stencil or a typewriter or an instrument where the pens are joined at the hip, for example, or a computer, then that would be a fundamental change to the process, which would immediately result in improvement. So up to that point, when I was thinking about the A's on their own, I'd actually if I just move back a bit, if you look at the A's on their own, you don't see the system. You kind of just see the output of the system, and you can be tempted to think about separating the A's into better or worse. But when you take into account the system, and you realize that the system itself is responsible for that variation, and so until we change the system, we're not going to get a different result, then that puts you in a different position, in a much more insightful position, and a more valid position. The same conditions other than one special difference. Any guesses what that might be? Have a guess. What's different about that A? You use your left hand. Thank you. That's great. I did use my left hand, and I'm also teetotal. So there you go. Non-dominant hand. That's right. Thank you. So what you're seeing then is that A has a special cause. Okay. And so Walter Shewhart, when he defined his theory of variation, he defined it according to two types of causes: common cause and special cause. And the key thing about this theory of variation is that when you see common cause variation, the action that will address it is change the process, a major component of it. And when you see special cause variation, the action that will address it depends on the cause. You have to do some detective work to first find the cause. So it's a theory of variation that helps you understand the cause of the variation and then tries to direct you to addressing that cause. And most of the time, processes and systems are dominated by common cause variation and not special cause. So if you go back to one of the slides, Deming said, 95%, 94% of the trouble lies with the system, 6% is special. This is kind of the image that reflects that statement. Okay, so if I was performance managing providers producing A's for me, and I said to them, I'll pay you more if you produce better A's, and I'll pay you less if you produce worse A's. Yet I designed the system, and I'd said to them, you have to produce them by handwriting your A's and so on. I hope you can see that I actually designed the system, and I'm the one who's essentially responsible for the capability and performance of the system. Yet I can actually turn my performance management system to those producing A's and make them feel good or bad, depending on the type of A that has just been produced, really. So again, it's very easy to lose sight of what the system is doing as opposed to what the workers inside the system are doing. I will move on, but feel free to ask questions and clarify, because I think I'm going through a lot, and also maybe I'm not able to gauge the extent to which some of this is kind of being absorbed or kind of landing okay. So feel free to kind of pause me and stop me, ask questions, or ask me to reverse back. So what Shewhart did in the end for us is developed a control chart. The control chart is a kind of statistical device. The yellow dots represent the A's that I've just produced. There's a set of limits usually set at 3 standard deviations from the mean, but don't worry about that for now. Just conceptually recognize that what you're seeing here is a picture of yellow dots inside a set of limits. Those limits indicate common cause variation. So when you see patterns like this is indicative of common cause variation, and the action is to change the process. And if you see dots outside the limits, then that's indicative of special cause variation, which merits some detective work. So if we move on, like any theory, it's not perfect, so it will make mistakes, and the key mistakes it will make is sometimes misclassify common as if it was special, and special as if it were common. Just think of diagnostic tests, for example. We do a test to a patient. We sometimes say to the patient, you're free of disease, when in fact they're not. And likewise, we say to them, you have disease, when in fact they don't. And like every other test, every other kind of classification, Shewhart's theory also makes that mistake. But I want to take you to the next slide, really, which is from Deming's work. Have a look at this, and I am going to pause for breath and comment. This is welded 1 to 11, and the welders are shown on the x-axis, and you've got faults from per 5,000 welds on the y-axis. So 0 is here on the origin, but not shown. And you can see the control chart. You can see the limits. You've got a limit of 19, and then you've got the average, which is the middle, and then you've got a 0, which is on the x-axis, but you can't see it. So just have a look at that data, and imagine you're now in charge of this group of workers. Using Schuhart's theory and the aid of the control chart, what actions would you take, please? That's right. So number 6 is indicating special cause variation. And therefore, the action to address special cause variation is do some detective work. Very sensibly, would start by talking to welder number 6. Okay, that's great. Now, what action do you recommend for the rest of the welders? I want to improve this system. I reduce the errors. What action should I take based on this? Just based on this data alone. Now we've dealt with number 6. So what should I do with the rest? Great. So somebody suggested that we should aim to improve the system generally, and somebody suggested we should support everyone to reduce the average. Okay. So and some of these comments have come as questions. If you just go back to the example of the A's. When you see common cause variation, what's the action that's required to address it? Change the system, take action on the system. So just as when I was handwriting my A's, if I moved from pencil to typewriter, I would get an improvement. That would be a change of system. Likewise, for the rest of these welders, we've got to find a change that moves them away from the current process or the current system to a new system. And until we create a new system, error rates will remain exactly the same as they are, except for welder number 6, who is special. We need to do something different about welder number 6. Okay. So the implications for leadership here, these are really, really important implications. Okay. Aside from number 6, who's special, everybody else, no welder is better or worse than their peers. From the point of view of the process that produced those errors, all the welders are the same. No welder should be singled out for special praise or merit award or naming or shaming. It would make, for example, no sense to ask welders number 10 and number 4 to retrain all the other welders. It would make no sense to put welder number 2 under special attention or special measures. All of those things would be wrong, a bit like the data that you saw for Eva. The only sensible thing to do here, the valid thing to do here, is actually to change the process of welding. So so one of the most challenging things to pick up from here is that all the welders are the same, except for welder number 6. And that's the only bit of information a leader needs to know. And then to improve the results for everybody other than number 6, we need to change the system. And how do you change the system? We think about how we change a major portion of it, a bit like the kind of pencil versus typewriter example. Whereas for welder number 6, we needed some detective work. I'm going to move on. So if you go back to the colorectal cancer example, remember here's the data, and half of our surgeons are less than competent, or a few of them are, and this idea that we should make our surgeons better by addressing those who are less competent than their colleagues. And if you plot that data on a control chart, this is actually what you see. It's essentially just like the welders, really, other than you don't have a welder, a surgeon who's above the limits. So actually, if no surgeon on the crude data, just on the percentage mortality, all of the mortality rates are consistent with the underlying system, and we can think of them as being produced under essentially identical conditions, a bit like the A's that we looked at. If you look at the case mix adjusted data, again, this is a little bit like the welder slide. Now, in our case, it's surgeon number 8 is showing evidence of special cause variation, but actually everybody else is consistent with common cause variation. Now, the reason I use the kind of research data set is A, because it's available, but B, because I wanted to just illustrate to you really this mindset that if you see variation and we can separate it out into good and bad, and then somehow eliminate the bad, we'll get better. That's a bear trap which lots and lots of people have fallen into. And I use the first slide with Mary and Eva to try and illustrate that. And then we've gone through the A's as an example. We've also seen this now in colorectal cancer. And there are tons of examples like this. Because when you see the data presented in the format of this table, for example, you lose sight of the system. The system is not visible to you, but its components are. This is like the bike taken apart. So you can't see the entire system. The control chart tries to bring back a view of the system. So the control chart boundaries are actually telling you the voice of the system, its capabilities, potential, its variability. And stuff inside it is consistent with common cause, i.e. it's the system, and stuff outside it is a signal that it's outside of the boundaries of the system. And it is very important to be able to distinguish as a leader whether you're looking at whether what you're looking at is common cause variation or whether what you're looking at is special cause variation. Because the actions required to address either of those are fundamentally different. Common cause requires a change to the system. Special cause requires detective work to understand the cause. I'll just move on to some other parts of lessons of variation then. So if you have a stable system, there is no use to specify a goal. So you remember I specified a gold standard A, and actually Walter Shewhart says there's no point, and you'll see why in a minute. You will get whatever the system will deliver. A goal beyond the capability of the system will not be reached. And if you don't have a stable system, there is no point in setting a goal, because there is no way to know what the system will produce. It has no capability. Now, again, this is really quite challenging because it is saying to us that we don't need to specify a goal, but the system does what it does, and it's perfectly designed to do what it does. But what happens is there is a mindset out there that if you create enough targets and incentives, then you can get systems to improve. So have a look at the next slide. So on the left-hand side, there's a graph of something over time. It's just performance over time. For those of you that are inclined to know, these are just random numbers generated from a distribution. So these are pure random numbers. And you can see there's a sense that the system is operating roughly around 4. And if you drew a set of control limits on it, a set of limits, then they might go up to somewhere around 8, for example. And along comes an initiative which sets a new target, and the target is just around 10, and that's the red line. And you say to the people working in this system, we would like you to improve your system to the new target, and when you meet target, we will give you lots of money, praise, attention. So that's the kind of theory of targets, essentially, that we think targets motivate and help people think improvement. So if alongside this we bring Shewhart's theory, then Shewhart's theory will tell us that actually the only rational thing to do here is to change this. If you change all the workers in the system, the performance would stay more or less the same. There would be no change. It's a bit like, if you go back to my A example, if I was to use a different kind of paper, my A's would. So the idea would be you'd have to have a fundamental change in the system if you want to meet that target. As it currently stands, this is not, that's a really, it's not capable of meeting the target. And so as you change it, it won't meet the target. However, if you don't allow people to change the system, just because often initiatives are brought to us very quickly, we have to turn around times are short, and often some people's bonuses or even jobs may depend on it. You have 12 months to turn this around or whatever. So imagine that option one is not available. You can't change the system. I'd like you now to have a guess at what else you could do to make the system on the left-hand side, i.e. that graph, look like it's moving closer to the target or it's operating close to the target. Give me a strategy of how I could make the current system look like it's operating closer to the target without actually changing the system. So somebody says change the target. That's interesting. So that is an option, but often we don't have gift over the target. It's often imposed on us, but that is an option. I agree. Give me some other options, please. Thank you. Change how you measure performance. Yeah. So if the system is not capable of achieving the target, which clearly it isn't in this illustration, and I don't allow you to change the system, then the only thing left to you, if you want to survive this target regime, is to distort the data or to distort the system. And that's why we have so much distorted data, and that's why we have so much distortion in systems, because the target becomes the de facto purpose. An example of distorted data, who would care to share an example of how data gets distorted in this kind of situation? Anybody throw an example out? Where we have a target and there's a sense of really important to meet that target, often financial rewards attached to it, but the system's not capable. So any example of distorted data anyone would share? Yeah, change denominators and exceptions. Probably a very readily accessible example would be A&E data, a kind of 4-hour target. And the notion that if somebody has been waiting for 3 hours, 58 minutes, then we try and get them admitted just because we don't want to reach the 4-hour target. And likewise, if a patient comes in the ambulance and A&E is full, then we would, it's not unusual for the patient to be diverted to a kind of target-free tent where they can wait, or wait on the ambulance really, so that the clock doesn't tick for them and so on. And I'm just using that to illustrate points really, that if you don't, yes, and somebody's made the point about medical admissions vaults and so on, absolutely. So the consequences of introducing a target in a system which is not capable are really very serious, because you create this environment in which distortion happens. And then there's this great hypocrisy that happens really between those who know the truth about the data and the system, usually working on the front line, and those who are managing the relationship with those who've imposed a target and trying to find ways of persuading them to not punish them or give them some money. So this is a real challenge and a real problem, and it goes back to the point that I just raised a moment ago that Shuhad said, if you have a stable system, it doesn't matter where you put the target. It will perform as it will perform. Its capability is defined by the process and the system and the constraints inside it, and unless you address those constraints, nothing will happen. But what you can do is create an environment where there will be a large amount of distortion, or at least a tendency to distort will be very tempting. Just one other thing to mention about systems. There's a very useful theory called the theory of constraints, which some of you may have heard of already. And it argues that systems can be thought of as links of a chain. And then if I was to say to you what governs the strength of a chain, the usual response would be its weakest link. At any point in time, there is one weak link in a chain. And if you make that weak link stronger, then everything else of the chain, then the whole chain becomes strong. But if you make everything else strong, but the weak link remains as is, then actually there will be no change in the performance of the system, and you'll have just spent lots of money and time and energy and get very frustrated. So, so identifying the constraint in a system is really important. And if you go back to the examples of writing the A's, the paper's not the constraint, the temperature, the light, the humidity, the blood pressure, and all the constraint is actually the manual process itself, the use of a human hand and a pencil, whereas if we use a computer or a typewriter. So not every change results in an improvement, but when you have a stable system to identify the constraint, and in the real world, we usually only have 1 or 2 constraints. It's never more than that at any point in time. That's why the theory of constraints is so valuable. It gives us a sense of what we might target, what we might focus on as kind of the weakest part of a system. The thing to bear in mind, though, is if you have a very wide boundary in a system, then that weak link can be in different places. at a different location in the chain, as it were. But if you draw a very narrow boundary, then the weak link will be within that boundary. So it depends how wide your system boundary is. But the general point being that identifying the weak link or the weakest link and addressing it is a very useful strategy. And then I'll just do one more thing, I think, for today. And this is this thing about knowledge and learning. I'll just ask you to have a read of Chanticleer's rooster and his experience with crowing and the sun. And every attempt to improve, underneath it lies a theory, whether articulated or not. And if we're going to use that to learn, then we have to learn to do what Chanticleer's rooster has done, which is take our theory and subject it to empirical evidence. I'll pause there because I think I've gone over time, and I think we've done quite a lot.